Hello, my name is Noel Adey. I'm the founder and partner here at Gravity 9. And today we're going to talk about something called domain storytelling, but with a slight emphasis on domain-driven design. Just a brief introduction to Gravity 9. We're a software consultancy. We help large or mostly established organizations build software, quite innovative software, to gain competitive advantage. We do that at speed, and we do it through with predictable delivery. And one of the key parts of that predictable delivery model is through breaking down large problems and into smaller problems that we can build and iterate on to break usually a larger program or a large modernization program down into smaller bite-sized pieces. And that's how we provide more guarantee on our delivery mechanism. Today I'll start off just talking through domain-driven design. Just as it's a complement to what I was talking about. We'll move into the storytelling piece halfway through this process, but I want to give you an overview of what domain-driven design is, why we use it, so I have some of the benefits that use domain-driven design, and then how it's complemented through storytelling. So domain-driven design, at the very high level, is kind of broken down into two parts. It's a mechanism to help software engineers often building solutions for organizations to both analyze the organization and understand sort of high level what that organization is made up of, and then low level how the technical implementation or product that you would build against that organization, how the technical side of things can complement the organization. And the idea is that we're trying to reflect core business vocabulary, if you like, and have those business scenarios directly related into technology and code effectively if we're building a product. So there's just kind of a two sides of it sitting here: is the analytical, strategic, and what we call macro design, which is looking at the larger pieces of business, and then the more technical, what I think we call implementation side of things, is the code and how that's reflected. So why DDD? It's not a new concept. DDD's been around for, I would say, 20 years now. And its main purpose is to reduce the risk of delivery. So software projects historically have been renowned for failures. So going over time, or we're delivering the wrong features or functionality. Some statistics here around how often projects fail. That 70% is a combination of things like projects go over time or over budget. Often complexity, the complexity that we tackle with domain-driven design, what we're trying to break down, is the main reason for that project failure rate. So generally speaking, when you talk to a larger organization and you're trying to build some functionality, it's the complexity of the business that causes those things. So, and it's a high level of things quite often look simple. When you get into a large project or even a small product, actually it's the devil's in the detail, and it's those things tend to cause projects to fail and go over time, go over budget. I've over 25 years experience at working with projects, so I can say with confidence that is the case. Projects are generally quite complex, difficult to break down, and domain-driven design I've been using for the past, say, 15 years, and it's really helped not only break through the complexity, but also provide a set of tools and toolkits to help you solve specific problems in particular ways that doesn't kind of put you in a box. It gives you flexibility, best practice, and allows you to solve what I think quite difficult problems in a very elegant way. So let's move through this. So as I mentioned earlier, we work with large organizations. There's usually lots going on in an organization. There's never usually one product or one application. And so domain-driven design helps us kind of frame a large organization or a project even within an organization to understand the context as to where we're working. So if we think of domain-driven design and how we break an organization down, it's a bit like painted with sections and pieces that got shown on the screen here. It's a bit of a breakdown of the full picture, but we want to break that down into smaller pieces so it's more manageable. And that's effectively the core piece of the strategic side of domain-driven design. We'll move through some of these pieces. So I called out earlier that there's a consistency between design code, the code and the reality. So that's the core objective, is to return business opportunity and functionality and process, and reflect that into the technical implementation so that you'll full money's worth effectively out with your technical implementation. And it also helps us make some decisions along the way. So we'll walk through this before we get into the storytelling, but breaking down your organization and understanding it from a few perspectives with these smaller chunks allows us to categorize those and understand whether we should look at building something that's custom or whether we should buy something off the shelf, which is always a consideration when you're thinking about building functionality into a large organization. So we'll run through those. This is just a slide ready to say that there's no adamant rules around DDD. There are guidelines and there are principles, and it's constantly evolving. And so I think storytelling is a good example of that. It's not been there through the lifetime of domain-driven design. It's something that's been introduced. And I think it's a great complement to something that's called the ubiquitous language that we'll get into a little bit later. Just to call out again, my experience has been, and the industry suggests, that domain-driven design was a kind of precursor to what we call microservices and micro UIs, event-driven architecture. These are all quite technical terms, but they're all less the de facto architecture patterns that we use today in modern architecture, but certainly for larger organizations. It predates these trends in the technology field, and you'll see how technology's probably followed the approach here as we go through the design for domain-driven design, or the implementation, I should say. So the analytical side of things, how is it different to how anyone works or how people used to work prior to domain-driven design? Quite often you would walk into an organization and someone responsible for the technology in that organization would probably have something like this on their wall, a big map of all the data entities that they can think of across their businesses and how they relate. And this was when I first started working in the industry, that around just before 2000. This was quite a common model, and people had a closer focus on the data as opposed to the behaviour. And that's one of the key changes I think domain-driven design brings. So we're thinking more about how things work and what the execution and behaviour is as over the data model. And so this view here is was a common way of explaining what your company or your organisation looks like, but very much focused on the data. So lots of relationships between entities, how they relate, and really try to model your entire business in one screenshot. Which doesn't really reflect reality because it doesn't consider the behaviour around that. It's just the data entities, and that's one of the key, I think, mistakes that many projects fail to is data, as opposed to breaking that out and maybe thinking about it slightly differently. And this previous approach would lead to something called a monolith. So lots of applications built in the past would be built with that sort of mindset in mind, where I've got a data model set up and then I'll build some application logic on top of it. And then that leads to something called a monolith. This is not a session on monoliths versus microservices. We've got previous sessions on that, so please check out our previous presentations. But monolithic application just leads to lots of extra work. It's difficult to own, it's difficult to deploy. And it becomes quite complex to AM time. I call it accidental complexity, where something simple to build initially because it's just one thing, but over time you add more logic and data and integrations into a solution. It becomes actually very complex in itself, just due to the structured growth of the product. what is domain-driven design and what's a domain? So the domain would reflect your entire organization. So when we're using the term domain, if I am a technology consultancy, as we are, our domain is everything that sits within that. That's our reason for being. That's who we are. So that is our main area of interest. But we don't want to look at it like that. We want to break that down a little bit. So the whole purpose of domain-driven design is to break things down, make things more consumable. And so we have a term called subdomains, and a subdomain is a part of your business or a part of your organization that represents some meaningful elements. One rule of thumb is to break out subdomain if it could potentially run as a specific business. If you pulled it out and outsourced that piece of functionality, that's a good suggestion that it would be a subdomain in your organization. Every organization is different. What one subdomain in one organization might not be its own subdomain. But also we categorize these things so they're not all the same. I want to walk through that very quickly here. So we have a few categorizations of subdomains once we've looked at an organization from a high level. And quite often, actually, we'll use something called event storming to get there. So a very good way to do a broad sweep of an organization. First step is to run something called an event storm. And that's a very quick and rapid way of gaining information across your organization. What's your business? What do you do? We label events, often a timeline, and that gives us an indication of all the functionality that supports your business. And that's everything from your customers engaging with you down to your accounts department invoicing that customer to sales and shipping and everything. But we break that down into smaller subdomains and then categorize them. And again, the categorization will vary depending on your organization. But there's three main categories that we run through here. That's a core subdomain, something that will pretty much give you competitive advantage. It's core to your business. If you're keep using this as an example, but software company, we deliver software that's core to us. So our core subdomain, our core piece of functionality within the business, I guess you could say, is being able to deliver software. So our process, our people, our training is all really quite core to what we do. If you're a flower shop, then you're probably going to your ability to build bouquets, that sort of thing is your core. A generic subdomain is something that most businesses will have, but it is a quite complex subdomain. So it's a high complexity kind of area of your business, but quite often it's been solved and it doesn't add too much competitive advantage to your organization. So an example of that would be an account subdomain. Every organization has accounts, but if you use one package or another, does it really give you much competitive advantage? Most businesses probably not. Some businesses potentially, depend on the business model. Again, that comes back to whichever organization you're looking at or you're looking through it. But yeah, generic is something you probably we'll move on to this in a second, but it's complex, but it's probably already built. And then supporting is somewhere in between. It's more of it's a simpler area. So something like communications or support in our world, support for a product will be considered a supporting subdomain, where it's not core to your values as an organization, but you need it, and it's not necessarily particularly complex to build. So quite often you can build a supporting domain because it's not particularly difficult to build, but it could be replicated very easily because it's not difficult. So hopefully those three things make sense. So core is anything that's really core to your business and gives you competitive advantage. Generic is usually quite complex, but already done and quite generic. And then supporting is somewhere between. It's not complex, so you could build it, could buy it, but it doesn't really add that much competitive advantage to your organization. And then we place those categories on kind of matrix. So, if you've got high complexity and there's high competitive advantage on the two kind of axes, the top right is something that you probably do want to look at building. So I've got a complex piece of functionality that really gives me advantage in my industry. probably look to build that because I can get one over on my competitor. If we're using the same products, everyone's using the same thing. Does it give you competitive advantage? Probably not. But then if it's low competitive advantage and complex, as we talked to earlier, that's where you're on the left side and the top. So that's more likely to be a generic subdomain. And at the bottom, it's not too difficult. It might give you some competitive advantage, but unlikely to. So less likely to build those two things. And we can plot our subdomains on this just to understand, and it helps just helps in those early decisions when you're looking at a large program or a large project as to actually which things should we be tackling, how do we prioritize them, what do we do? Do we build a package? Do we buy a package in this, or do we build it? So that matrix really helps. We just kind of done this earlier, but this is really taking our business, looking at our subdomains, putting that over onto our matrix, and making some decisions as to how we take those forward. Do we build them or buy them? The next thing I'm going to move into, I'm going to move off of domain-driven design in a second, but just to say, so we've got a concept of domain. That's our full business, a full organisation. We've got subdomains that sit within that, so I'll think of those as potentially lines of business, but possibly more granular. And then within those, we have something called a bounded context. And this is, again, this is the DDD vocabulary, where a bounded context represents a deployed piece of code. So if I've got an account subdomain, I've probably got an account system, and it sits over here. It's deployed independently. We might integrate into it, but really it's its own, what we call transactional boundary, but it's an installed piece of software that serves a purpose specifically for that subdomain. I won't go into that in a third because it gets a little more technical. As we get into subdomains and bounded contexts that fit into what we're trying to do is understand the business, broad contexts, the entities that support it from a data perspective, but also the behaviors and interactions. And so domain-driven design first asks you to define a subdomain, but then it asks you to describe it using a ubiquitous language. And there's no defined way of doing that. So the reason for having a ubiquitous language is to agree across, whether it's departments or just within a department, everyone is understanding what your entities, your behavior and your interaction should be. Sounds simple and obvious. However, having been in the process of building software, that is one of the biggest problems, I would say, is communication between people, a clear understanding, a common understanding what your entities and what your behavior is. And so, again, it sounds quite simple and obvious, but I would say that's one of the biggest reasons that projects fail. They either go over budget or you deliver the wrong thing because of misunderstanding between siloed departments or individuals with a different understanding of what something should or shouldn't. So a ubiquitous language is designed, think of it as a kind of catalog, a way of describing what happens within that bounded context or within that subdomain. And they can be different across your businesses, and they probably should be. So you might have multiple subdomains, and nearly every organization will have. And within those different silos, those different subdomains, there are quite often very different vocabularies that represent the entities and the behavior within them. So the ubiquitous language is designed to make that clear within that subdomain. But just to be clear, it is just that subdomain. It's not a full organization context description. Here's some good and bad examples of a ubiquitous language, but really what we're trying to focus on is the business language. It's not technical language. So some good examples of really just where we're saying, a customer in this instance wants to select some preferences and add it to, their profile. That's a good understanding. You would pin down what your vocabulary is there. So preference is a defined thing. Everyone agrees that as a customer, there's a customer preference. What we don't want to do is start talking about how things happen. And so on the bad side, we've got user selects a preference, adds it to the data store. So we want to kind of avoid those situations, those descriptions, and be much more focused on wording entities and common understanding of what people are and what the associated entities are. And this slide really is just to call out, we've got different bounding contexts, different subdomains, and potentially have the same entities within them. So just calling back to the discussion we had the overview I had earlier around, broad data set or broad data schema of an organization. What we're not trying to do here is normalize everything to the point where we only have one customer table, for example, in your organization, and that holds everything about a customer. Is what that tends to do is pull everything towards a customer table, and then you end up with that monolithic sort of set of behavior that's always constantly get back to the customer. What we'll try and do, and this is a slightly different approach, and sort of I would say is in the face of normalization. Back in the maybe 20 years ago, data was much more expensive to store, so you would probably want to normalize it into much more today, and that's less of a concern. We're actually more concerned with organizing our behavior and actually being okay with having duplicate information. And that's kind of what we're saying here is I've got a customer entity in 3 different subdomains. I'm going to represent that customer in potentially different ways because the vocabulary and the behavior around them is different for each of our subdomains. And that's really important because we don't want to store everything in one place. Again, so for example, accounts receivable, I probably have information about the customer, their previous payments, their missed payments, payment plans, whatever might be around accounts receivable. But I probably don't want to store that on a company website, so I'm not interested in their payment history. Well, I might want to surface that, but I'm more interested in things like their preferences and their login and those things. So it's the same person, same entity, different data, and that's quite important from a breakdown perspective because we're trying to build software that isn't tied together. We want to build nice, literally decoupled components and have products and systems that are responsible for specific things, and we just loosely integrate into them. I'll move forward very quickly. This is just a very brief thought around aligning your bounding context or your systems to those subdomains. So we've got a whole 4 different subdomains here. And best practice is to try and keep the implementation bounding context within your subdomains and not have them overlap. So if we have, say, product-wide span over all of our subdomains, that's a suggestion that we've got monolithic application or monolithic organization where we're solely dependent on one product. So all of our needs for all of our business. What's a much easier architecture to own is to break that down, have different systems responsible for different concerns of your business, and have that organization in place up front and build something. As opposed to having accidental complexity, you've got this sort of intended complexity. It's not quite as straightforward as building an app and just putting everything in it. And actually, you add a layer of rules, and DDD is that set of rules, and allows you to build complexity in from the start so that the complexity doesn't grow exponentially as it does if it's not planned. So there's always complexity. It's how you manage it, I suppose. So domain storytelling, onto the main part of the discussion here. So talked a little bit about subdomains, bounding context, how that fits. We have other sessions on domain-driven design, so we can break that down and take into more detail here. What we want to focus on here is getting into how do we describe the subdomain. And we found actually domain storytelling is quite effective at doing this. So it's a technique to transform domain knowledge into effective business software. That's its objective. And so that suits really cleanly the idea of having broken down silos and well-described vocabularies inside them. Core concepts. So it's a diagrammatic principle. So storytelling is it's quite a visual process, and the idea is of trying to bring collaboration together with kind of sort of visual prompts, if you like, so that people can look at something, understand it at a glance, and that breaks down some of the misconceptions or disagreements between teams, and you can easily pull something now and it's relatable. I think that's what the visual piece does. So here we've got the first concept. There's 3 core concepts with it, domain storytelling. The first is an actor. So every story is retold from an actor's perspective. We start every story or every line of a story from an actor's perspective. And an actor could be anything from an individual person, could be a group of people, could be a system. So we've called out a couple here, LinkedIn, Meetup. our website, gravity9.com, and a domain expert. But so that it's either one person, a group of people, or a product or a system that's working with some responsibility. And then the second concept is a work object. Work objects represents it's another noun, so it's not an activity. It's an artifact, if you like. So it could be a spreadsheet, could be a cinema ticket, could be anything, but an actor will engage with or either change, create, amend, or process. And that brings us on to the third concept, which is the activity. So we'll go into an example in just a second, but those are the three things. An actor is doing something with a work object, and that simplicity, I think, really helps bring this to life. Certainly in a broad audience of non-technical people, there's only three core concepts that you need to consume, and those are they. Okay, so we're going to look at an example. So Gravity9, we're a software development company. We're just going to take a little bit of a step back and kind of assume that we've done some analysis and looked at our organization, and we've got these subdomains that make up our business. And we've got delivery, which is part of our software development process. We've got marketing, which is obviously marketing of our services and our products. And that accounts. R&D is core to what we do, so learning new capabilities and exploring innovation is key to our success. And trading, because it's about our people. Account management, working with our clients. And then we called out one here that's specific to this example, and hopefully closer to what we're talking about today. But so event management is part of what we do. It's what we're doing today. So we're going to drill down into events management just as a bit of an example as to how we might use storytelling in the real world. So this is we'll move on to, I'll explain a little bit about the types of diagrams you might build. What I'm going to start with is a very high level. There's some good books, and I will put them in the notes, on domain-driven, storytelling. But there's a number of kind of levels that you can work on. I don't use the formal approach. It's like a cloud, sky, sea, and CMed type analogy that they use. I tend to just use a sort of 1, 2, 3 high level, a mid level, and a more detailed level. What we're going to just walk through here very quickly is an example of a process that we want to document using storytelling at the high level. So it's high level and it's as is, so it's a current state kind of view of the world. It's not what we want it to be, it's what is happening today. So the example is to plan an event or events planning, subdomain of our business. So we've got one domain expert here. So domain expert within Gravity is probably a software developer, solutions architect, or someone with some expertise that has some information that we would like to talk about. So we're just describing this flow as a kind of a workflow, if you like. So domain expert makes a suggestion or suggests an event subject to our event organizer. And so we've got 1, 2, kind of what I call legs of the activity of the diagram. And we've labeled that first activity as the first, that's a sequence number in the event of all events across this story is all run through. So the second thing that happens is that events organizer will then agree an event date and a venue with the domain expert. The domain expert will then generate an event content, some event content that they'll be presenting at the event. And then next, the marketing team will probably get involved and format the site isn't on SK in. So that's the next thing that happens. So we'll review the content being generated by the domain expert and format that. And however that should be branded. The event organizer then, step 5, schedules the events. And for this instance, we schedule our meetup. The attendees will then register for the event. And then finally, from a registration perspective, the attendees will attend the event. And then finally, the domain expert will run the event on the day. So there's other things that will probably happen in that. So it's quite high level, lots of detail as to how that, the specifics of how those things happen. But what we're trying to do is get a string, sort of a process map together to understand what's this subdomain of events management at Galaxy 9. We've done a first stab and a rub through. And for me, I don't know how you guys feel, but I look at some flowchart diagrams with squares and forks and those things that find much easier to consume at a glance. So when you're in a room talking with people to walk through, I think the icons and the kind of structure of this is quite easy to understand. It also lends itself to, I'll get to this a little bit later, but as we're getting into implementation and to the completion side of things and the delivery side of things, each one of those lines, each number of lines could represent a user story. A user story is a mechanism to describe a small piece of functionality that could be delivered in a sprint. So hopefully that makes sense. But generally speaking, the ideal is each line out of starting with an actor should sound like a short sentence. So domain expert suggests an event subject to events organizer. And then we can run through all those, but it should sound like a very consumable sentence that could be understood by someone, and then that allows us then to drill down a little bit or as to how it works. So the ubiquitous language, we've started to adopt storytelling in conjunction with a number of other tools. I didn't mention the other tools earlier, so I'll just call out that we would also use something called Gherkin or some test cases to describe ubiquitous language, which again is just brings together the whole technology and non-technical audiences so that we can all align and agree on what we're trying to achieve is right. That's the whole objective of this. And we might also use, go back very quickly. So we might use storytelling, which is new for us. We've got a process mapping mechanism that we use to do the same, or we use Gherkin, or it's just a definition of terms. Once we pull that together, what I'm trying to show here is that process flow can then be sort of reduced into what is effectively a store or a catalogue of your terms. And that's quite important. I think that's the key to storytelling. It brings people together, gets understanding clear. And then you have a catalogue of not only your actors involved in the process, but also your objects, your work objects and your artifacts. And that's what we do to drill down into, for example, here in event content. Well, what is an event content? Call it out a process map. Someone's going to create one. But what is that? And that's just as important, I think, as process. Start calling out what our work objects are and what some of the criteria and success criteria of the building of those artifacts are. So having that clean catalogue of work objects gives you the ability to drill down, agree these things that often get muddled if you don't define them clearly. So it's a nice way of putting stuff together and having a nice clean set of artifacts that once you get into a build process or a build scenario, it's clear and it's unambiguous. The same is true of the sort of actors as well. So work objects, it's great to describe those and say the criterion, define structure for them. And doing the same for actors is just as important because they could be different things. It could be the same person with zones of different roles, but falling that out early and agreeing that within a subdomain is important. The other thing that it helps us do is to sort of start to subdivide our subdomains. So at this point, we've highlighted some very high level subdomains. So events management, for example, is quite a big ring. And what we're trying to get to as an organization or when we're working with clients is to not build anything too big. And so ideally build microservices or employ small products or utilities that do specific jobs really well. And so here, we're not happy with having this large process deployed to one component. It feels like too much. And so we can start to see some trends in the diagram where if you see something that looks like a handoff, it's a good example of maybe that should be its own sub within that subdomain. So we start to break down the subdomain into smaller bounded contexts, and those are the implementations. So, for example, here, a domain expert's going to generate some content, build something, and it can fall to my marketing brands, but that's nothing to do with scheduling, and it's nothing to do with facilitation on the day. So that feels like a separate thing. And that's what we've done here, is sort of called that out on the diagram. And then we've called out the scheduling piece. So there's a whole area of expertise around scheduling. There's a whole area of expertise around content generation and the quality of that generation. And then finally, there's a facilitation, which is on the day who does what. That's a different process within that. So what we're trying to do is just break down the problem, divide, conquer, and get to the smallest problem possible that we can solve really well and implement that. And that kind of lends itself to our delivery mechanism. So our success comes from breaking things down and deploying something not too large, and breaking down larger problems into smaller problems, and then delivering solutions that support those small problems just to reduce risk. So yeah, that's what we did here. We broke the subdomains down based on looking at our diagram. We felt like it was in need of some refinement. Content management was something we called out. And so now we can break that down further and get to a sort of lower level detail. I call this a level 2. So we come from a level 1, which is a real high level process, and then level 2 will break them down into a subsection of that subdomain. And this is a good candidate for potentially a bounded context. So one thing that would hold this logic. Now, whether we build this or buy it, it's not really the concern at this point. So whether it's a product doing it or whether we go and code this logic and this behavior. But it feels like the right kind of level of granularity to put something together that supports the behavior. And so really just going into a bit more detail. We've still got the domain experts. We've still got the same marketing team actors. We've introduced a system or a product that's sitting there that they're interacting to. So this is now a 2B version of what we'd like to do. And as opposed to in a current state, this is our desired design going forward. So same concept, domain expert is going to create a document about the event content. And that's the first line there. Second one, they're going to store it, but they're going to store it inside of the marketing content store. Third is an update to it. So we're recognizing now that it's not just a linear flow. I'll touch on exceptional circumstances in a second, but this is a successful effectively, so we're not expecting any problems here. But we would expect the problem do a store and an update, and then finally a submit an approval request to the marketing department or whoever's listening or responsible for that approval into the system. System's then going to announce that request for approval out to the marketing team. They'll review the document within the document store, and then they will approve the approval request in it. So it's a lower level of detail. It's much more confined, and then this lends itself now to what could be an ethnic in a project. So if you've worked with Scrum teams or Agile teams, we tend to structure work or break down work into things called epics and user stories. So an epic being a sort of body of work that will take some time to build, and a user story is small pieces of functionality that we can generally build within what's called a sprint, and that's often a 2-week period where developers are building, something with a number of ceremonies, but the expectation is that we'll build that functionality within that 2-week period. And so that's what I've done here, really just taken those lines, I've broken them down, and because it is very sentence structured, we touched on that earlier, we've got a number of user stories that could go under event content generation epic, which is create content, and then there's a standard or a de facto standard approach for user stories, which is as a domain expert. So you're calling out the actor at that point. I need the ability to, and then this one would be create some content, and I need the ability to store my content. So it follows exactly from your domain of storytelling. So that's a nice tie-in, because we've got high levels, top-down view of what we're trying to achieve from a big product perspective. We drill down into one piece because we want to tackle one piece and tear that off and get that built first. So that's the priority. And then we drill down all the way down into each of the user stories that would represent that. So that's what I like about this, is it brings the domain experts together with technologists. Everyone's talking the same language, and you've got a complete drill down from your high level granularity down to your low level granularity, and that turns into actual work, which gets put into the sprint, and developers and designers and testers and get around and put into a real product by an outcome. And that's why we're here. So that's the most important thing. So as we get into this, if we were building something, and this is our area, so if we were building something, we would integrate into something probably, but for this example, we felt like building a product, this was enough competitive advantage for us to do something slightly different. We'd build our subdomain with our bounded contents here, which is even a smaller slice of that subdomain, and start to look at building this out. And those entities, so this language here is coming back to the domain-driven design. So entities, aggregate roots, and value objects, they're all types of object that actually exist in code that represent the real world. So we would have things like, an aggregate root that might be event content, and we might have an entity of that aggregate root that represents an approval request, and an approval as an attribute on top of that approval request. So those things get a little more technical. It's talking more about how we model stuff in the actual code. But again, that ties it all back, because what we should be able to do is look at a piece of code, read through that piece of code, and someone who's non-technical reading at a high level should be able to get the gist of that code, not Edison go-to statements and highly technical reading. It should be quite logical and reflect what the business is saying in your code. And that's key to domain-driven design. And I think that's how a storytelling piece really ties it together quite well. Just to say, once we built that, and again, this is moving more into the technical side, but we represent our code as a sort of isolated thing. So we've done all that hard work around understanding what your business is, and then we drill down into a subdomain, and then we've understood the behaviour of that subdomain, and we've sort of gone into a smaller area. We finally built, or we want to build, this bounded context, which quite often we would build a microservice to represent the functionality that we could just walk through. So all of that behaviour will be built into code. And we want that to be very we want that to be under-diluted. And by that, I mean not lots of technical call-outs to technical services. We want to be able to have a piece of code that represents the logic that we just all agreed in the business, because that's the most expensive part, from my experience, is working with 30 people in the business, tearing them away from their day-to-day, understanding what they want this thing to do, and then building that into logic. So I want to encapsulate that logic into something that I can reuse. And that's the whole point of domain-driven design. You end up with a piece of code that's reusable. And then we get into the more technical side of things. Of what we're really trying to say is there's services and integrations and all these quite complex things around events and infrastructure. But actually our core piece of logic is one thing that's very user-readable and also testable from a business perspective. And then we effectively plug that in to all of that other complexity, like services and events and service buses, and if you've ever heard of those terms. That's really what we're trying to do, is make that reusable. So I can take that out one hosted application and potentially put it into another one, and again reuse that business logic. It's never quite that simple, but that's the idea of the core business domain code we're building. So yeah, that's kind of a walkthrough. So hopefully that makes sense. I've gone through some overview of domain-driven design, a bit of an overview of storytelling and the protocol around that, for that, and how that helps us move from something quite big. Usually we end up with large problems to solve them, and our main objective is just to keep refining that problem and bring it down to something small enough that we can confidently build something and deliver it in within the time and budget constraints. And that's how we do it. So this is just a summary of big picture subdomain. We talked about that, breaking down a subdomain, further dividing that into smaller bounding contexts, and then we start to build, and then our output should be something
that reflects real world in code. So,
Thank you. All right, so let's then, if there's any questions, please feel free. Charles.
When you're talking about the subdomains, are you mainly talking about different departments in businesses? And if that's the case, how do you work through the different cultures and learning styles and languages that might exist in those departments?
Yeah. So the question was, the assumption was that subdomains are sort of kind of departments and organizations, and that how do we tackle the differences in potentially culture, approaches, and different vocabularies? I would say that's one of the core points of breaking it down. So rather than treating everyone the same, they've all got their own language, they've all got their own culture, process, procedures. That's actually one of the benefits, because you can say, okay, we're going to go and look at the accountants department, and they're very detail-oriented. They'll have particular terms that the rest of the company won't be familiar with. And if you go to marketing, they'll have completely different terms. They'll be talking about the same person, but in completely different ways. So I think that really helps us. And then you can, if you isolated that team, you can use standard tools like storytelling or dictionaries just to describe those things and get them down. But actually, you're free to have that conversation unpolluted, and that helps. That's sorry, because they can have their strong opinions on how they work and what they do. And it's out of the context of how these guys work over here in sales, for example. It's going to be a very different approach. And if you bring those two together, it's great. It's collaboration, and we do that early on. But it's good to sort of take them apart and actually get into the detail of, like, I need to talk your language because we need to get this right. We're building an account system, even more so. We don't want to get something wrong. So it's good to understand people, and that, I think, subdividing that actually helps that, because they are different. And if you work at a company that's, I don't know, maybe more physical, they're out on the road, or they're out maintaining things, it's completely different, another world completely. So they're not all in the office. They might not all have the same vocabulary. So it's a good place to bring those guys together and understand, what are the common pitfalls, issues, general thought process in that space without, some other departments saying, no, it's not like that.
How do you build future-proofing into this?
I would say the key part of any future-proofing is abstraction. And the second piece is composition. So what I mean by that is the domain-driven design toolkit itself at a technical level is very future-proof, in my opinion, because it allows you to build things to an interface. I can take this business logic and I can put it into a real-time analytics sort of host, where it's listening to things, it's going to check in with the logic, and it's going to spit something out. Or I could put it into a simple microservice where someone's just asking a question of it. So you've got options to move your logic around, but also how you build that logic and the patterns. And I haven't included some of the technical stuff here, but abstraction is key there, so we can change our data storage technology without disrupting the logic. But also within the library, it's very loosely coupled. So I called out the concept of an aggregate root earlier. That an aggregate root an example would be, we call out event content peer. If there's an approval, we felt like that would evolve independently. We create it as a different aggregate root. Those two things don't have a hard link together. And we connect them through something called domain events. That actually is a massive extension point. So if I do something today in my event content, I'll simply throw out a bunch of events to say I've done some stuff. I changed this, or I changed the content, or I added in a picture. Something else can be included into that model without the event content knowing it's being included. Now you've got an extension point at that point. So actually I could go and talk with an LLM or some AI to do something slightly different on it. I'd create an image, so I can again process that with models and understand what's in the image, for example, and tag it. That can all happen in extension points. Is so much easier because you've got that layer of abstraction between all of your entities within your domain model. So, and also just having bounded context, like the whole purpose, and again, I haven't really gone into the technical side of things, but bounding concepts are often represented with microservices and micro UIs, isolated behaviour. Again, they're throwing events out at infrastructure level, so we're throwing things have changed. And again, you can build components even at the higher level and integrate things. So I can extend any other component without even that old component there.
Makes sense. It's a future-proofing.
Thank you.